So just to give us a sense of how we'll go through this today. So we will start by talking about the book of Genesis, and thank you, Abraham, for starting us off on that. Just a sense of who it was written to, why it was written, when it was written. Then we'll go and try and understand the word image, which is what we're going to talk about today, right? So what does this image thing really mean? And then we're going to go into that Genesis passage. That's our passage for today, and maybe the first two chapters of Genesis. Not read the whole of thing, but understand what is it saying about image in that period, in those writings, right? Then we'll try and understand what's happened to that image over a period of time, how we understood it or misunderstood it, and what's happened over time ever since that was written. And then we will look at a few ways that we can respond to that in our own lives. Is that okay? So let me just read some of the scriptures that are key to what we're going to talk about. There are New Testament scriptures on the image of God, and there is the Old Testament passage that we are about to read. So let me just read that for you. So I'll request Pauline to put that up. So we'll start with Genesis, which is what we're the passage given to me was from all the way from chapter 6, verse 6 to verse 31. And just for your understanding, verse 6 to about verse 25 onwards is all about God creating the earth, right? And everything that's in it, and those detailed accounts. How many of us were at home group last week? Did you enjoy that conversation? I thoroughly enjoyed it. It was like, we've talked about this ever. I've known Jesus for a very long time, and yet when you start talking about what he says in his word and some of the things, they just come to you so fresh, and so I'm looking forward to what how we take that conversation forward. So the creation story is what we talked about, and everything that implies. And Abraham led us in that conversation about how God is a God of new beginnings. And that will come a little bit more fresh as we talk about who Genesis was written to. It's very interesting, okay? It's a little counterintuitive if you haven't done that study for yourself, but that's interesting. So, but let me read this. Genesis 1:26 onwards. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and increase in number. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground." Then God said, "I'll give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth and every tree that has fruit with seed in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth and all the birds in the sky and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw all that he had made. It was very good. And there was evening and there was morning, the sixth day. Yeah. Have you read that passage before? Okay. We have, right? And yet, it's amazing. So let's just get into the book of Genesis itself. I'm just picking up on a few things that Abraham had shared with us before. So let me ask you, when was Genesis written? Any guesses? I don't expect you to be historians and have exact dates. But do you have any guesses when it was written? Ah, yes, Moses. Okay. Any other guesses? When was it written? But actually, that's still, she's giving a sense of it was written around when Moses was alive. Okay. Any other guesses? Yeah, this is my trick to wake you up. But Pauline, I'm sure you have the answer. Around 15th century BC. Ah, that's what you had mentioned. Did you say 15th century BC? 15th century. Yes, it's the first book of the Bible, uncle. That's exactly right. But I'm asking, and that's the interesting question. Do we assume that just because the first book of the Bible, it was the first book that was written? Job was written first, which is somewhere in the middle, right? So actually, 15th century, it was based, and my understanding is that it was written sometime, if during the exilic period. That's one of the theories out there. 15th century would not be exilic. That would be way before exilic. Yeah, it was 1500. But these are the times. So the reason why we have all these different dates is because actually, while tradition says that Moses wrote it, it was actually written by a whole bunch of people, right? And it came together. It began to come together in that period, and during that. Is the 15th century date there because Moses was probably there during that period? Probably. That's probably why traditionally we think about it late. But actually, it came together over in the next few hundred years after that, and it was actually put together during the exilic period. Right now, why is this important? To understand why this is important, we look at the context of that exile, right? Do we know what the exilic period is? Just to give you a sense of it, it is a period when the last king of Judah, which is Zedekiah, rebelled against Babylon, which had already annexed Israel and had Israel on its, as a part of its empire, and he was taken by Nebuchadnezzar back to Babylon, and basically he was killed. So the country, so Judah, which was the only thing that was left of Israel, didn't have a king, right? So they didn't have a king. And before that, they didn't have a temple, right? So the temple that was there, it was destroyed, and it felt like Babylon was a strong nation, stronger than Israel, right? And they were under an imperial power at that time. And Genesis 1, in one sense, speaks directly into that crisis, right? So, who was Genesis written to? It was written to the people of Israel when they were in that general condition. It came together. So, the book came together during that period. By the way, the book of Genesis and the oral tradition and some written tradition was there before that, but it came together in that period. And one of the things you will notice is that during that period, the Egyptian, the people of Israel had experienced the Egyptian and the Babylonian creation stories. You know that the Genesis is not the only creation story out there. There are multiple creation stories that are there, and people had gone out of the safety of of Israel and had now gone and heard all of these other creation stories which were there, right? And what else had they seen? They had seen kings that claim divine status. You do know that, right? The Pharaoh was considered as God, and this is very important when we think about the whole idea of image. Pharaoh was considered as God, and he was worshipped almost as God, and it was a tradition. Even many other Kingdoms and kings were considered as gods. So kings were divine, kings were gods. And as a people, they were tempted to believe that they were small, defeated, and insignificant. Right? Wouldn't you? Wouldn't you? We have no king, we have no temple, our land is gone, our walls are broken, and half of us have been just removed from one place and put into another. And so that gives me the idea that Genesis is not necessarily trying to give uh, a scientific answer to how the universe began. And Genesis may not be trying to answer what are humans made of, psychologically and all of that stuff. But Genesis is trying to answer the question in that scenario that people are facing, who is God? Because we have an understanding of God from tradition that you're hearing and your own understanding of God. And then you're answering the question, God is a God who creates, for example, without violence, because the other myths talked about creation through violence. God speaks, but he's not necessarily fighting. All right? God himself is not a part of creation, but he is the creator. Who are we as human beings? We are not slaves of the gods. We are not divine accidents. Some of the myths said there was a battle and then there was drops of blood that fell and then those drops of blood became human. That kind of sounds like, it just so happened that human beings got created. And we are not just only valuable if we are kings, right? So those were the kind of questions that the Genesis was answering in the context of what people were going through. All right, so in that sense, Genesis 1 and 2 was shaped for a people who had lost everything that defined human worth. No temple, no king, no nation. And it's declaring that human worth never depended on any of these things. Think about yourself in a place where you've lost everything and you're getting to know who God is afresh, and you're getting to know who you are afresh, right? And so let me come to the question of image. So have you heard of the word we were created in God's image before? If you have, can you raise your hands? All right, so many of you. What did you make of it? Anyone? What does that mean? What does it mean to you? Sorry again, we are all made in his image. Great. That's important. The we are all part is really important. What else? We are created in? Right. But what does that mean? God has no gender. Okay. Okay, Trinity. He imparted his characteristics on us. What else? To be holy, the characteristics of God. Special. Yeah, we are special. It sounds basic, but very profound indeed. Anything else? It's a privilege to be made in the image of God. Wow. Yeah. Thank you for that. When you look at others, it's a reminder that they are made in God's image. What else? I mean, my trick is to get you to finish this subject so that we can all go home. It doesn't depend on capacity. Why? Hmm. It's an inherent given that cannot be taken away. It doesn't depend on capacity. What else? There's nothing else in creation created in the image of God. Yeah, we are unique, which is an unpacking of the we are special that came from the side. Yeah. What else? Yeah, we come from the image of God, and so we reflect some of his characteristics. God is omnipotent. Yeah. Except, but we are not omnipotent. Yeah. Omnipresent. But what about us? What about us? The image of God in us. Children of God, part of his family. Yeah, so have I woken you up with the multifaceted ways in which we can look at image? But the original word, the Hebrew word selim, basically was not an abstract or philosophical term, right? A lot of the things that we are saying are slightly philosophical. They are correct, right? But they come after a reflection that happens over a period of time. Oh, what does this really mean? But when you think about the people who were listening to this, what did it mean? What did it mean to them? Right? It most commonly meant a statue. It meant it meant a physical representation. But most importantly, it was a visible stand-in for something that was, or someone that was absent. So it's like a reality. It's something that makes another reality present. Sorry, I'll say that in English. Let me unpack that. How did people in the ancient Near East understand the word image? Basically, an image functioned as a representation of a god or a king, right? So all of these people, the Pharaoh, Nebuchadnezzar, whoever, are somewhere else in Babylon, in Egypt, and all of that stuff, and they have empires everywhere. And you have this thing that is kept, in saying that's Pharaoh. That's Pharaoh. So you better believe that that's Pharaoh. You better believe that that's Nebuchadnezzar or whoever that is. So that's the understanding they got immediately when they heard the word image. Is it beginning to make some sense? So statues of kings that were placed in distant territories, or cult statues placed in temples, or images that stood for something else that they represented. So that's what they were hearing. Yeah? And so what it did not mean to them at that point of time was all this intelligent stuff that we said, right? Intelligence, rationality, inner psychology, personality traits, and all of that stuff, even conscience, was not something that they understood. That's something that we have unpacked over a period of time and made it and understood those interpretive layers, right? But what they would have immediately understood when it was said to them that you are made in God's image is that this is something bigger than what I thought. This is something bigger. This carries some authority for human beings. This makes someone present where they are not. And who that someone would be? That would be God. God is present where they don't seem to be. How? Through his image. Right? This stands on behalf of another. So the word would signal status, role, representation, visibility of power. And think about the people who are listening to this. And all of this would not need explanation, like we need this explanation. For people there, it was pretty straightforward and clear because they were living in that context. And so when Genesis says, let us make mankind in our own image, it would almost certainly be heard as humans are being described with language normally reserved for kings. And what would have been shocking to them? That the image representation that was reserved for kings now is not just for the king, but for all of humanity. The same language is not just for the male elites, it's for male and female. Genesis 1, 26, 27. It's not tied to temple statues, it's living persons. It's not localized in one place, but it's spread across the whole earth. And so God is democratizing royalty. Everybody is his royal representative. The living representative of divine rule, right? So the interesting thing at that time, of course, is that you can imagine that the Israelites themselves were not, they actually considered images as something that they should stay away from, right? Because that was what was told to them. And so this was even more difficult for them to grasp. And yet, God was getting them to understand it. God was giving that message to them, right? So, let's talk about some of the themes in Genesis as to what this image word would mean. All right, and I'm going to request Pauline to put up like one slide, and don't worry if you can't read it. I mean, it's like a table of all these different themes. I'll probably send it across. What does it say about image? What does it mean in these books of Genesis? So first is something that we already mentioned, right? It's representation, the first two things there, authority and representation of that authority, which is in the verses 26, 28, and 27. Okay, 26, 27, 28. Let us make man in our image. So therefore, these people represent us, and they have our authority. All right? Let me go further. Human dignity. When you read 131 and 9:6, 9:6 is basically don't shed blood because mankind carries the image of God. So don't shed blood. Essentially, the whole idea of human dignity comes from 131 and 9:6, right? And also the idea of male and female sharing. Okay, that's 131. And so that is the image of God, and there's human dignity to all of humankind. Okay, not some over others. Okay, that idea is coming across from here, right? What else is coming across? Somebody mentioned Trinity, right? So the relationality aspect. Let us make. Did you capture that? Did you catch that? I mean, if it is not pointed out to you, you don't catch that. What does 126 actually say? Let us make man or humankind in our own image. Let us. Who's us? Yeah? It's not saying let me. It says let us. And let us make them in our image, male and female, diverse, right? And yet united. And the whole aspect of being relational is core, it's core to the image of God, right? And then in Genesis 2 onwards, it starts talking about care for creation, and it, even in even in the passage that we just read, it's talking about care for creation, and that authority that's given to us to steward what we've been given. So we are stewards of what we've been given, right? Fruitfulness. One of the things, one of the great conversations that we had in our home group was about, how God is creative. Yeah, the entire book of Genesis talks about God being creative and God, creating heavens and the earth and doing a whole bunch of mechanics to actually get this whole thing together. And at the end of that, he's looking at saying, this is really good. And do you see a sense of God's creative character in that, and the fact that He's given that to us? And so when Jonathan Uncle does his carpentry thing, he's reflecting God's image. When you're writing a song, you're reflecting God's image. When you're finding creative solutions to the world's problems, you're reflecting God's image. And not only, so if, I have an uncle who says, we almost forget that the Bible has Genesis 1 and 2 and Revelations, the last two chapters. I forgot the numbers. Because we are, what are the numbers again, Abraham? 21, 22, thank you. And so, because we live in a world in between Genesis 3 and Genesis 20. Why is that significant? Because the fall happened in Genesis 3. Okay, mankind sin and all of that stuff. And so since then we've been on this project. Like God has been on this project of redemption, reconciliation, all of that, basically correcting a problem. And that problem gets corrected back in Revelations 20. But there's Revelations 21 and 22. And there was Genesis 1 and 2. And so LT, his name is, he calls it from the garden to the city. So it started with the Garden of Eden, which is perfect, by the way. It moves to the city, which is also perfect, which basically means that even if the fall had not happened, the garden would have become a city. How? Because of the creative work that God continues to give us. So therefore, the work that we do is an inherent part of God's image, right? Moral and spiritual responsibility is pretty clear. He has given us mandates and said, you do this and you don't do this. And so that's part of it. Creativity and a culture is like in some form connected to the fifth one. Right, so the fifth one has to do with work. The seventh one has to do with creativity, and I feel they are kind of very connected together. And then there's this really relational ordering of society. There is, the family units and all of that stuff that gets created. And what is not there in Genesis is that last one. And so those are there in other texts. What is that? It talks about Jesus and what Jesus is doing. What will happen to us. So, shall we read those 3 verses in the New Testament, which I didn't read, and bring them into focus for our conversation? I'm not going to unpack the verses, but I'm just going to bring them out there for us. Colossians 1:15. The Son is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. Right? Romans 8:29. For those God foreknew, He predestined to be conformed to the image of His Son, that He might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. 2 Corinthians 3:18 says, For we all who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory are being transformed into His image with ever increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit, right? So that is not in Genesis. And that's why, but that's a confirmation that the idea and the theme continues in the New Testament in a way that's relevant to what we're all going through, right? So, just to give you a sense of the different themes of the image of God. So, how does this idea translate to us today, right? This is all Genesis, by the way, except for the last one. Do you think it's relevant today? All of this is relevant to us today. We are reflectors of God's image today, right? And so to be human, just the fact that you are a human being, is to be entrusted with representing God's presence in the world. That should feel a bit overwhelming. And so all the words that you mentioned about it was, it's a privilege, we are special. All of those are true. And just let that sink in for a minute. To be human is to be entrusted with representing God's presence in the world. And what is it not? As some of you said, it is not grounded in productivity, intelligence, morality, belief, all of that. It's not grounded in that. It's not revoked by failure, sin, weakness, exile, marginalization. Did someone say we should look around and recognize that everybody else is made in God's image as well? Jane, you said that. And this is before any social category or political category or religious category. Right? So people who were listening to this in the Babylonian exile would have not only recognized that this is not just for us as Israelites who are oppressed and marginalized, this is for everyone, including our oppressors, the Babylonians. Difficult and yet profound, right? So why are we saying these things? Why are we saying that the image of God is not revoked? Because, again, in Genesis 9:6, it's grounding the protection of human life. Don't murder, don't kill, because they are made in God's image. In James 3:9, it's basically assuming that people are still in God's likeness, even if they are behaving badly. So, like someone said already, human worth is not something we generate. We don't generate human worth. It's something we already carry. Let that sink in. And what happens when sin overtakes us is not that this image is erased, but its exercise becomes distorted. How does the distortion happen? Because what did we say earlier? That to be human is to be a representative of God. The distortion happens when we stop representing God. That's the distortion. Right? And so, how did this come to us? Because God gave it to us, right? He created us like that. He gave us that authority. And now what's happening? We stop recognizing Him as the source of that authority and make ourselves the authority. So we still act powerfully, we still have the power, but we now do it in our own name. And so what happens? Authority becomes domination. Is sounding familiar? Are you reading the news? Rule becomes exploitation. What did God give us to steward? The earth. What are we doing with it? Not ruling, but exploiting. Difference becomes hierarchy. Because what was equal has suddenly gone into groups and cliques and power centers and and the weak and the oppressed, right? So these are not losses of humanity. These are not loss of the image of God. It's a misuse of it. And what else happens? We reduce our human worth to function. Jason was praying and saying, a lot of times we understand who we are based on what we do. Yeah. And so what we do is what we are. That's what it gets reduced to. How does this show up? It shows up in slavery. Who are you? I'm a slave. Shows up in the empire as the empire. Shows up in caste. It shows up in gender hierarchy. And it shows up in the modern productivity culture. Sounds familiar? I am sucked into that. I'm guilty of that. And these distortions, they imitate representation from God, but they empty it of God. And so, humans are still representing something, but they are no longer representing God. Instead, they represent self, tribe, nation, ideology, market, power. Because we stopped representing God. You know, I like to provoke some of my classmates sometimes who are nationalists and who think India is the greatest country on earth, etc. And you know, if we ask the question, what about the poor in India and how have we treated them? What about the people who are oppressed? What about the ones who are marginalized and how we are treating them? Should we or should we not, as a proud nation, still ask those questions of ourselves? Or should we ignore all of that and just revel in our bravado of how great we are as a nation? And that goes for all nations, right? That goes for all units. Can I be self-critical? Can I be critical of my family? Can I be critical of, you know, whatever, my workplace, my company, or whatever it is? Because I'm not representing them. I'm representing something else. Yeah. A misalignment of allegiance is the problem. And in the New Testament, this starts coming up as, you know, we've lost our relationship with one another. We image the wrong thing. And in Romans 12, we know it says we conform to certain patterns and we need to be transformed. We need to put on a new self and all of that stuff. So we're not replacing humanity, but we are reorienting it. So the modern question that we ask today is not, do we still bear God's image? Because, you know, it's been a long time since Genesis. And was it only for them? Is it for us? No, it is for us. What was talked about was for all of humanity, right up till now. So we still bear God's image. But the question is, what are we imaging? Are we imaging God? So if you are that representative of God, are you representing God? Right? So the image of God was not destroyed by sin. It was redirected away from God. And the work of restoration is a realignment of that, right? So what does this mean to us? I think some of everything we've said already would have come home to you in where you are, and then that's the point of it. This is not merely like a cerebral exercise. This is about you and me. And the first thing is to ask ourselves the question, how do I recognize my worth? On what basis? Do we believe it when we say that our worth is a given? It is not something that we achieve. Can we stop prioritizing what we do instead of who we are? So we live in systems. The messaging around us is all of this thing: achievement, output, visibility, momentum. And this keeps coming to us so much, that we internalize the lie that our usefulness is our worth. But think about this. Remember what God did when He finished creating you? He looked at you and said, "That is amazing. That's where your worth comes from." So I know a lot of us are, in these places of trying to figure out, we have this thing called midlife crisis, maybe, but that's for people of my age. I think every generation, many of you sitting here are struggling to understand what gives you worth. And most of the time, it's tied to career and money, isn't it? Most of the time. And a lot of times, if you're in ministry, it's tied to ministry productivity. What did I achieve? What did I do here? What legacy am I going to leave? And all of those nonsense questions that we ask ourselves. Sounds familiar? Can we stop that? And as a corollary to that, can we stop doing that to the people around us? And that's when, the systems around us teach us to treat the people who are lower, who are less articulate, who are less good looking, with some level of disdain and some level of categorization which puts them in a different category. But how do we instead first start by ourselves, by stopping doing that to ourselves and stop doing that to everybody else? And then you start looking at the world from a completely different lens. Why do you think it's so easy to live in a society with so much of inequality around us, with people hungry, and pass them by? You know why? Because somewhere inside, we have believed that they deserve that. What are we doing? And even if we don't say that explicitly, or even if our language might say otherwise, but our actions show something else. The image of God. Treat all humans with equal dignity, irrespective of their status. See the beauty. See the shatteredness of something that is the image of God. When you walk around the streets and see people who are drunk and lying on the streets, does it strike you that is the image of God right there? And it should not be. Or do we tell ourselves the story, they just deserve it. They messed themselves up. It's their fault. But remember, sin doesn't take away the fact that they are in the image of God. So, the first invitation, if I may ask Pauline to put up for us, can we allow God to redefine the scoreboard by which we measure ourselves and others? I'll leave you with that just for a few seconds. Let me move ahead. Can we represent God instead of ourselves? Which is something that we've already spoken about. You know, because the image of God is not just only about worth, it's also about representation, right? That's the point we've been making. And Genesis does not say that humans are made in God's image so that they can express themselves. It says they are made in God's image so that they may rule, which is what? To act on God's behalf. I'm still digesting that. You know, I hope you are too. And then that raises a searching question: whose name is our power really is our power really serving, right? And so, can we submit our power under God's lordship rather than our own? We all have power, by the way. You know, our power is formal, informal, leadership, expertise, influence, money, voice. The question is not whether we have power. The question is, under whose authority does it operate? And how do we use power for the thriving of others? And now this is very challenging because all of us are struggling with life, and I know that. You know, I know so many of your stories. You know my story. We are all struggling. Most of the time, we are struggling with the point number one: what is my worth? And we are stuck in the rat race. We are actually in a great place. We are still in the top 10% of the economic categories of our country, but we feel like, you know, everything is wrecked. Just if there's a small few hiccups here and there. So we are very, very far away from thinking about how do I use my power for the thriving of others when I'm so busy just trying to survive, which is not really surviving. We're just stuck in a rat race. In scripture, distorted image bearing always shows up as power used to protect who? The strong, and crush the vulnerable. But faithful image bearing looks like power that creates space for others to live. And so it reframes leadership, it reframes ambition, it reframes success. We don't represent God by being impressive. We represent God by being accountable. And so with that, let me leave you with the second invitation. The last couple of weeks, I've had the privilege of just spending time with so many people who've basically just given up their lives trying to follow this. They're around us, by the way. I mean, otherwise the gospel wouldn't be functioning. Just look around you and you'll see them. The definition of success is different. The definition of productivity is different. It's God representation. And truth be told, most of the time if you do this, you will land up slightly poorer than you could be. If you do this, you will land up not getting that promotion that you thought you should get. If you do this, you might have a smaller productivity targets to report than you would have otherwise. But you know what that is? That's being accountable. That's representing God. Because all of those things that you didn't get, you actually didn't need so much. But the people that you did it for needed it desperately. And you were being accountable with it. Can we consciously shift from self-representation to God's representation? Because deal with this. You and I are representing God because we are made in His image. Number 3, and we'll finish with this. Can we reflect the relational image of God together? Right? So, what did we say about the image of God? The Trinity. It is collective by default. And so it is not about individuals. And there's nothing is about individuals. It's all about a collective, where we come together. So it's about humanity together, male and female, shared, communal. And this means that the image of God is not fully visible in isolation. It's not like, different images. Image of God is reflected as a collective. And so it's collective and not competitive, right? So we don't compete. We are not competing with each other. Difference is not a threat to our image, but it's part of how it's expressed. So if someone is different from me, wow, that's me plus that. Not, oh, now I've got to shine brighter because I've got to suppress that. No. It's me plus that. It's wow. Right? So this is not about radical individualism. This is not about self-sufficiency. And this is not about the idea that my personal relationship with God is the whole story. Have you heard that one? I don't need all of this. I do my own quiet time in my own little room. But you are not like that because you're here. The image of God is collective. And it becomes clearer as we live in mutuality, shared responsibility, interdependence. It becomes clear. So look around you. That's the image of God. So can we resist the temptation, that's the third invitation, to image God privately? Instead, commit to imaging God together, across gender, generation, strength, weakness, difference, all of that. If we are made in the image of God, then our worth is a given. Okay, I'm just summarizing. Our power is accountable. Our humanity is shared. The question is not whether we bear the image, but whether we are willing to live in alignment with it. Genesis tells us what humanity was meant to be. The New Testament tells us who shows us what that truly looks like. Who's that? The Bible doesn't introduce Jesus to replace Genesis. It introduces Jesus because the image of God has been distorted, misused, and misunderstood. And then it makes this remarkable claim, which we read, Colossians 1:15. The Son is the image of the invisible God. It doesn't mean we stop bearing God's image. It means that in Jesus, we see the image lived clearly, fully, and without distortion. And what does that image look like? Jesus does not prove his worth through achievement. If you look at Jesus' career, it's the most failed career you've ever seen. He basically had no status, he had no money, he had no career, he died the death of a criminal. Biggest failure on earth. Because his worth was not secured by any of that. It was received because God said to him, "You are my son, in whom I am well pleased." That was his worth. And Jesus has authority, right? He said the Son of Man has authority. But what does he do? In Philippians 2, it says, He gave it up for the sake of others, for the sake of one another. It's about responsibility, service, and making room for others to live. In 1 Corinthians 5, 17, 18, it says, in Christ, a new creation begins and reconciliation follows. The image of God becomes visible again because pride gives way to humility, rivalry gives way to forgiveness, and difference is not a threat. So the question is not, do you bear the image of God? Because you do. The real question is, do we allow our worth to be rooted where Christ's worth is rooted? Do we place our power under His lordship? Do we reflect His image not alone, but together? Genesis tells us that we are made in God's image. The gospel tells us that that image has a face. Jesus. His name is Jesus.